The night the Alpha King died, something impossible happened. A man tried to change fate itself, but no matter how many times he went back, he was always too late.
Long before whispers of betrayal ever drifted through the stone halls of Moonspire Citadel, before the kingdom of Valdrin would one day face a night that would fracture its future, there lived a ruler whose presence alone could silence an entire gathering of wolves. He was known by many titles. To allies, he was the Alpha King of Valdrin. To enemies, he was something far simpler. A storm they prayed never to face. Alpha King Eric Thorn. In the northern territories, where forests stretched endlessly beneath silver moons and the cold winds carried the distant howls of roaming packs, strength was the law that shaped every life. The werewolf clans of the north believed that power was not something given, it was something proven. Every alpha earned his place through dominance, discipline, and the unbreakable will to protect his pack. King Eric embodied those laws more than any ruler before him. He was not a king who ruled from comfort behind stone walls. He was an alpha, born from a bloodline that had commanded wolves for generations beyond memory. When he walked into a room, the instinct of every wolf present responded immediately. Not out of fear alone, but recognition. The instinctive knowledge that an alpha had entered, and in Valdrin, there was only one true alpha, Eric Thorn. Valdrin itself was more than a kingdom. It was a packed territory, one of the largest and most powerful lands controlled by werewolf clans in the northern world. The capital stood beneath the towering fortress known as Moonspire Citadel, a structure carved from black mountain stone centuries earlier by the first Alpha Kings. The citadel overlooked the valleys below like a watchful guardian. From its walls, a wolf could see miles of dense forest stretching across the horizon, broken only by frozen rivers and distant mountain ridges. Within those walls lived the royal pack. Luna Selene, the king's mate and queen of Valdrin, Prince Alaric, the young heir to the Alpha throne, and their daughter, Princess Lyra, whose bright spirit often softened the otherwise disciplined life of the citadel. Together they formed the heart of the royal bloodline. To the outside world, they were a family, but within the ancient traditions of werewolf society, they were something more. They were the Alpha bloodline, the wolves chosen by fate to lead the entire pack. Yet the Alpha King himself was not known for gentleness. Eric had not risen to power during peaceful times. The northern lands had always been filled with rival packs, wandering war bands, and clans that challenged Valdrin's authority. Many of them believed they deserved the throne. Eric had spent most of his life proving otherwise. He ruled with discipline that bordered on ruthlessness. Rebellious packs that refused Valdrin's command were crushed swiftly. Raiders who attacked the kingdom's borders were hunted down without mercy. Some called him harsh. Others called him a tyrant. But no one questioned one undeniable truth. Under his rule, the kingdom remained strong, and in the world of wolves, strength was survival. The campaign that would later become legend began during the final weeks of winter. Scouts had returned to Moonspire Citadel carrying troubling news. Several southern packs, smaller clans that had long lived beyond Valdrin's influence, had begun gathering together. Their warriors were raiding supply routes. Their howls had been heard deep within territories that belonged to the Alpha King. The royal council urged caution. They suggested sending smaller forces to drive the packs away. Eric refused. A true alpha understood something others often forgot. If a rival pack began gathering strength, waiting only gave them time to grow. So the Alpha King did what every warrior in Valdrin expected. He led the army himself. Hundreds of warriors marched south beneath gray skies heavy with snow. Their armor gleamed faintly beneath the pale winter sun, while the crimson banners of Valdrin, marked with the symbol of the moon wolf, fluttered above the moving columns. Many of the soldiers were werewolves who had trained since childhood to fight for their pack. Their instincts were sharp, their loyalty sharper still. When the army reached the contested valley, the enemy packs were already waiting. The battle that followed was brutal. Wolf howls echoed across the mountains as warriors shifted between human and wolf forms during the clash. Claws tore through armor, steel struck bone, and the valley became a storm of violence beneath the fading night sky. At the center of it all fought the Alpha King. Eric moved through the battlefield like a force of nature. His wolf form was massive, larger than most alphas from rival packs, and his presence alone sent waves of instinctive fear through the enemy ranks. By the time dawn began touching the mountains with pale light, the outcome had already been decided. The southern packs had fallen. Those who survived scattered into the forests. The valley grew quiet again. After the battle ended, the warriors of Valdrin began gathering the wounded and securing the area. The wind carried the bitter scent of smoke across the battlefield. Broken wagons and discarded weapons lay scattered across the frozen ground. War always left behind the same strange silence once the fighting stopped. King Eric walked through the remains of the valley alone. His armor was darkened with ash and blood, yet his expression revealed little emotion. Victory was expected. It was simply the natural order of things. As he moved between the fallen remnants of the enemy camp, a faint sound reached his ears. At first it was so quiet that he thought it might be the wind. Then he heard it again, a cry, soft, weak. Eric turned toward a shattered supply cart lying near the edge of the battlefield. The wooden frame had collapsed, its wheels broken and half buried in snow. The sound came from somewhere behind it. The Alpha King stepped closer. When he moved around the cart, he saw the source of the crying. A baby, no more than a few months old, wrapped in torn cloth that clearly belonged to someone who had not survived the battle. The child's small face was red from crying. Tiny hands reached upward helplessly. Behind the king, one of his soldiers approached cautiously. "My Alpha King," he said, lowering his voice. "That child carries the scent of the southern packs." In the world of wolves, scent rarely lied. The baby belonged to the defeated clans. The soldier waited for the order that seemed obvious. But Eric did not speak immediately. He looked down at the child. For a long moment, the battlefield seemed to hold its breath. Finally, the Alpha King bent down. He lifted the baby carefully into his arms. The soldier stared in confusion. "My king?" Eric adjusted the cloth around the child before turning toward the path leading back to Valdrin. He said, "We return to the citadel." The soldier hesitated. "And the child?" Eric did not even slow his stride. "He comes with us." No explanation followed. No justification was offered. The Alpha King had spoken, and that was enough. As the army began the long journey back to Valdrin, many of the warriors whispered quietly among themselves, because in all the years they had served under the Alpha King, no one could remember a single moment when compassion had guided one of his battlefield decisions. Yet that morning, beneath the pale light of a winter dawn, the most feared Alpha in the Northern Territories carried an enemy child away from the ruins of war. And none of them, not the soldiers, not the generals, not even the Alpha King himself, could have imagined how deeply that one decision would one day shape the fate of the entire kingdom. The journey back to Valdrin took many days. Winter had not yet loosened its grip on the Northern Territories, and the roads leading toward Moonspire Citadel were heavy with frosts and drifting snow. The army of Valdrin moved steadily through the forested paths, their banners swaying above the long lines of warriors. At the front of the column rode the Alpha King. And in his arms, wrapped in thick fur blankets now provided by the royal attendants, was the child taken from the battlefield. At first, the soldiers said little about it. Wolves were not known for questioning the commands of their alpha, and Eric's authority had never been something any warrior wished to test. Still, whispers traveled quietly through the ranks. Some believed the king had taken the child as proof of victory. Others thought the Alpha King might simply be curious about the bloodline of the southern packs. A few said nothing at all, choosing instead to focus on the road ahead. But one thing was certain. No one truly understood why the most feared Alpha in the northern lands had chosen to spare the life of an enemy child. And the king himself offered no explanation. By the time the towering silhouette of Moonspire Citadel rose into view against the pale winter sky, the news of the army's victory had already reached the capital. The city surrounding the citadel had begun preparing for the return of their king. Torches lined the outer roads. Villagers and merchants gathered along the streets, eager to see the warriors who had defended Valdrin's territory once again. Above them all, the massive gates of Moonspire Citadel slowly opened. The fortress stood like a dark crown atop the ridge, its ancient walls carved from stone so old that many believed it had been raised by the first alphas of the northern world. As the army entered the citadel grounds, the atmosphere shifted. Warriors dismounted. Servants hurried forward to attend to the wounded. Messengers ran through the corridors to announce the king's arrival to the royal household. At the center of it all walked King Eric, still carrying the child. The sight drew more than a few curious glances, but none dared question him. Inside the great hall of the citadel, the royal family waited. Tall pillars lined the chamber, each carved with symbols of ancient wolf clans that had once sworn loyalty to Valdrin. Above them hung banners representing the Alpha bloodline, their crimson wolf emblems glowing softly in the firelight. Standing near the throne was Luna Selene. The Queen of Valdrin possessed a quiet authority that matched the strength of the kingdom itself. Her long dark hair fell over her shoulders, and her sharp eyes carried the calm intelligence of someone who understood the delicate balance of power within a royal pack. Beside her stood Prince Alaric. Though still young, the prince already carried himself with a calm confidence expected of a future alpha. His presence lacked the fierce intensity of his father, yet there was a steadiness about him that many in the court admired. Near the queen's side also stood Princess Lyra, whose curious gaze rarely missed anything happening within the castle. When the doors of the hall opened and King Alaric entered, the entire room fell silent. Every wolf in the chamber instinctively felt the shift in the air. The alpha had returned. Alaric walked forward without hesitation. When he reached the center of the hall, the queen's eyes moved to the child in his arms. For the briefest moment, surprise crossed her face. "A child," she said softly. The king stopped before her. "He was found on the battlefield." The words were simple, delivered without emotion. The queen studied the baby carefully. Even at such a young age, the faint scent of southern pack blood could be detected by those with sharp instincts. Selene understood immediately. This child was not one of theirs. For a moment, the great hall waited to see what she would say. Then the queen stepped forward. Without hesitation, she gently adjusted the blanket around the baby, ensuring the cold air of the hall did not reach him. "He will need warmth," she said calmly. The king said nothing, but those who watched closely noticed the smallest shift in his expression. The queen then turned to the attendants standing nearby. "Prepare a chamber for the child," she ordered, "and find a nursemaid to care for him." The servants moved quickly. If the Luna of Valdrin had accepted the king's decision, no one else in the room would dare question it. In the days that followed, the presence of the child quickly became known throughout the citadel. Servants whispered about him as they passed through the corridors. Some said the king had chosen to raise him as proof that Valdrin had conquered the southern packs completely. Others believed the Alpha King simply wished to see what kind of wolf the child would become. Whatever the truth might be, one thing remained clear. The child was staying. The queen herself oversaw the preparations for his care. A small chamber near the royal nursery was arranged. Warm furs were placed around the cradle. A nursemaid was assigned to watch over him day and night. Even the princess often visited, peeking curiously into the cradle whenever she passed the room. From that day forward, the child of the battlefield became Kale of Moonspire Citadel. And though he had been born among enemy packs, he would grow beneath the roof of the most powerful alpha in the northern world, raised among wolves who ruled kingdoms, among princes and princesses, among a family that the world believed to be united underneath the rule of their Alpha King. And so, the years of Kale's life within the House of Valjean quietly began.
Time moved differently within the walls of Moonspire Citadel. Beyond the fortress, seasons changed with sharp certainty. Winters froze the rivers solid, spring brought restless winds through the forests, and the long summers filled the valleys with green life beneath the open sky. But inside the citadel, the passing years often felt quieter. Children grew, soldiers aged, kings ruled, and the ancient stone walls watched it all with the same silent patience they had held for centuries. The baby who had once been carried through the gates in the arms of the Alpha King did not remain small for long. Children rarely did. Gale's earliest memories were shaped by the towering halls of the citadel. The walls seemed impossibly tall to him when he first learned to walk. The banners hanging from the pillars looked like enormous waves of crimson cloth drifting far above his head, and the endless corridors of the castle often made him feel as though the fortress itself had no true end. Servants moved through those halls constantly, their voices echoing softly as they carried out the work of maintaining the great stronghold. Many of them watched Kale with quiet curiosity in those early years. Everyone knew the story. Everyone knew the Alpha King had brought the child back from a battlefield in the southern territories. Yet no one treated him poorly. Within the royal household, the command of the king was law. If the Alpha King had chosen to raise the boy within his home, then that was how things would be. Besides, Kale was rarely alone. He grew alongside the other children of the royal family. Prince Ulrich, the heir to the throne of Valdrin, was already old enough to understand the world around him when Kale arrived. At first, the prince had simply watched the new child from a distance. He had been curious, not suspicious, just curious. But as the years passed and Kale grew from a quiet infant into a walking, talking child, that curiosity turned into something simpler: familiarity. The two boys were raised within the same halls, taught by the same tutors, and trained under the watchful eyes of the same castle instructors. Inevitably, they spent much of their time together. Sometimes they explored the castle corridors in search of hidden staircases and unused chambers. Other times, they wandered the lower courtyards where soldiers practiced their drills, watching the warriors clash steel blades while trying to mimic the movements themselves. When the weather was warm, they raced through the gardens below the citadel walls, their laughter echoing between the stone towers. In many ways, they grew up like brothers. Princess Lyra, younger than both of them, followed them everywhere whenever she could. She had inherited none of the strict discipline often expected of royal children. Lyra's curiosity was endless, and she possessed a way of asking questions that often forced the castle tutors into long explanations about subjects they had hoped to simplify. She loved stories. Stories about the ancient Alpha Kings who had built Valdrin. Stories about the wandering packs that once roamed the northern forests before the kingdoms were formed. Stories about the wolves who had defended the citadel during its earliest wars. Whenever the royal historian visited the children's study chamber, Lyra was the first to sit forward eagerly. Ulrich often listened with quiet interest. Kale usually remained silent, absorbing every word. The Alpha King, however, did not spend his days within the nursery halls. Eric ruled Valdrin with the same fierce determination that had defined his earlier campaigns. Council meetings filled many of his mornings.
Military reports arrived regularly from the distant territories of the kingdom. Messengers carried news of rival pacts testing the borders of Valdrin's lands. The responsibilities of an Alpha King never truly ended. Yet even with those burdens, there were moments when the king appeared unexpectedly among the children. Sometimes he watched them from the edge of the training yard while they practiced basic sword forms with wooden blades. Other times he passed through the study chambers during their lessons. Whenever he entered a room, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Even as children, the three of them could feel the instinctive weight of his presence. Eric did not speak often during those visits, but when he did, his words carried authority. Balance, he once told the boys while observing their practice in the courtyard. A wolf that lunges without control loses the fight before it begins. Alaric had nodded quickly. Cale repeated the motion silently and returned to his stance. As the children grew older, their training grew more demanding. By the time Cale and Alaric reached their early teenage years, the instructors began teaching them the disciplines expected of future warriors: swordsmanship, strategy, tracking, pack tactics used during hunts and battles. The royal training yard became one of the places where the boys spent most of their time. Captain Rowan, the commander of the Citadel Guard, oversaw many of those sessions personally. Rowan was a veteran warrior who had served under King Alaric for decades. His thick beard had begun turning gray, but his sharp eyes missed very little. The captain treated both boys with the same strict expectations. Again, he would say whenever their blades clashed too slowly. Again. Sweat soaked their training tunics. Dust rose from the grounds beneath their boots. Yet neither boy complained. They had grown used to the rhythm of discipline. Some afternoons ended with the two of them collapsing against the stone wall of the yard, breathing heavily while Lyra sat nearby, pretending to read a book she had little interest in finishing. "Rowan is trying to kill us," Alaric once said between breaths. Lyra rolled her eyes. "He's trying to make sure you don't die in battle." Cale simply drank from the water flask he had been given. The years continued passing in this way, quietly. Naturally, the royal household moved through its daily routines without interruption. The queen managed the affairs of the court with calm precision. The king ruled his kingdom with the authority expected of an alpha. The prince prepared for the responsibilities that would one day fall upon him. The princess filled the castle halls with endless questions and laughter, and Cale grew alongside them all. Within the towering walls of Moonspire Citadel, the four of them formed something that looked, to anyone watching from the outside, like a family bound by the same roof and the same traditions. Brothers, sister, parents. A royal pack united beneath the rule of their Alpha King. For many years, nothing disturbed that balance. Life continued forward beneath the silver glow of the Nordland moon, and the ancient fortress of Valdrin rushed over them all, as it had watched over countless generations before. Years passed quietly within the towering walls of Moonspire Citadel, and the children of the royal household slowly stepped out of childhood and into something far more dangerous. Adolescence among wolves was never gentle, especially not among those born or raised within the house of an Alpha King. By the time Cale reached his 17th year, the once small child found on a battlefield had grown into something few within the Citadel could ignore. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried a natural strength that seemed to grow with every passing season. His movements were sharp and instinctive, almost animalistic in their precision. Even during ordinary tasks, there was a certain alertness about him, as if some deep instinct was always watching the world around him. The castle trainers noticed it. So did the soldiers. And though few said it aloud, many began to whisper that the boy possessed the instincts of a true wolf warrior. Prince Ulrich, now nearly the same age, had grown into a very different kind of man. Where Cale was sharp and intense, Ulrich was calm. Where Cale moved like a hunter ready to strike, Ulrich carried himself with quiet composure. The prince was not weak, not in the slightest. His training had made him a skilled fighter, and his mind for strategy impressed even the seasoned generals who occasionally tested him with battlefield simulations. But there was something else about him, a patience, a stillness. Many in the court believed it was the mark of a future ruler. The two young men still trained together almost every day. The royal training yard had become their second home. Under the watchful eyes of Captain Rowan, they practiced swordsmanship, spear combat, and the brutal hand-to-hand techniques used by elite wolf warriors. Sometimes the sessions lasted hours. Steel blades clashed beneath the open sky. Dust rose from the ground as the young fighters circled one another. Rowan rarely praised either of them, but he never needed to. The intensity of the training spoke for itself. One afternoon, as the sun dipped toward the western mountains, Cale and Alric faced each other with wooden blades once again. They moved quickly. Strike, block, step, turn. The rhythm of combat flowed between them like a language they had practiced for years. At one point, Cale lunged forward with sudden speed, his blade striking toward Alric's side. The prince twisted just in time, deflecting the blow and countering with a quick strike toward Cale's shoulder. The wooden blades cracked together sharply. Both of them stepped back. Captain Rowan nodded once. Again. They attacked simultaneously this time. Cale's movements were aggressive, almost feral. Alric fought with calculated precision. For several moments, neither gained the advantage. Then Cale spun unexpectedly, knocking the training blade from Alric's hand. The weapon landed in the dust. Silence followed. The watching soldiers exchanged glances. Alric raised his hands in surrender, breathing hard. "Well," he said with a small laugh, "I suppose that one belongs to you." Cale lowered his blade. "Only today." Captain Rowan stepped forward and picked up the fallen weapon. "You both fight like wolves," he said. "That is good." Then he turned and walked away. That was the closest thing to praise he ever gave. Elsewhere in the citadel, Princess Lyra had grown into a sharp-minded young woman whose curiosity had never truly faded. Though she no longer followed the boys through the training yards, she remained deeply involved in the life of the castle. She studied diplomacy, history, and the complex alliances that held the northern kingdoms together. More than once, visiting envoys had been surprised to discover how quickly the princess understood the delicate politics of their world. The queen often said Lyra possessed the instincts of a strategist, and Lyra rarely disagreed. Still, she spent much of her time observing the people around her, especially her brothers, because that was how she thought of them, both of them. The Alpha King, however, had begun noticing something else. King Eric had watched many warriors grow during his lifetime. He understood the signs of strength, he understood ambition, and he understood the quiet instincts that shaped the nature of a wolf. Sometimes, during the late evenings when the court had quieted and the torches burned low in the great hall, he summoned Cale to speak with him privately. Those conversations were rarely long, but they were direct. "Strength alone does not make an alpha," Eric said during one such meeting. Cale stood across from him, listening carefully. "A wolf who rules must understand fear," the king continued. "Not only the fear of his enemies, but the fear within his own pack." Cale nodded slowly. The king watched him for a moment. "You listen well," Eric said. "I tried to learn," Cale replied. That answer seemed to satisfy the Alpha King. Outside the walls of the citadel, the world continued moving in its endless cycle of shifting alliances and territorial rivalries. News arrived regularly from distant. By the time Cale and Prince Alaric became young men, life inside Moonspire Citadel had changed in quiet ways. The children who once ran through the halls were now warriors in training. The soldiers in the castle no longer saw them as boys. They were watching the future of the kingdom grow. Everyone knew that one day Prince Alaric would become the next Alpha King of Valdren. It was the way things had always been. He was the king's true son, the heir to the throne, the future leader of the Wolf Kingdom. But in the training yards, and sometimes in the quiet corners of the castle, another name was spoken just as often: Kale. The boy the king had found on the battlefield, the boy he had brought home and raised inside the royal walls, the boy who had grown into one of the strongest young warriors in the citadel. Many soldiers had watched him train. They had seen the speed of his strikes. They had seen the way he moved during combat, fast and sharp, like a wolf born to hunt. Some of them believed that if Kale had been born into the royal bloodline, he might have been the strongest alpha the kingdom had ever seen. But those were only whispers, and whispers were dangerous things inside a royal castle. One evening, after a long day of training, Kale stood alone on one of the high balconies of the citadel. From there, he could see the entire valley below. The wind was cool, and the moon was slowly rising above the distant mountains. Small lights from the villages below flickered in the darkness like tiny stars. Kale rested his arms on the stone railing and looked out across the land. "You always come up here when you want to think." The voice came from behind him. Kale didn't even turn around. "I was wondering how long it would take you to find me," he said. Princess Elira walked over and stood beside him. She crossed her arms on the stone wall and looked out at the valley as well. "You're not hard to find," she said. "You always come to the quiet places." Kale smiled slightly. "Maybe I like quiet." Elira studied his face for a moment. She had grown up beside him. Just like her brother Ulrich, she had watched Kale grow from a child into the man standing beside her now. To her, he had always been part of the family. Still, there were moments when she wondered about the things Kale never spoke about. She asked, "Do you ever think about it?" Kale looked at her. "Think about what?" "Your past," she said gently. For a moment, Kale did not answer. The wind moved softly through the towers of the castle. Finally, he said, "I think about it sometimes." "That's all?" Kale gave a small shrug. "There isn't much to think about." Elira wasn't so sure about that, but she didn't push him. Instead, she looked back toward the distant forests, the same forests where Kale had once been found as a baby. At the same time, in another part of the castle, Prince Ulrich was finishing a meeting with several commanders of the royal guard. Large maps were spread across the table in front of them. They showed the borders of Aldrin and the lands beyond. "We'll increase patrols along the southern forests," one commander said. Ulrich nodded. "That's a good idea. The southern clans have been quiet for too long." The soldiers exchanged glances. Quiet enemies were often the most dangerous. After the meeting ended, the commanders left the room one by one. Ulrich remained behind. He walked to the tall window and looked down into the courtyard. Torches burned along the training yard below, and in the distance, he could see Kale walking across the stone ground. The prince watched him for a moment. Then he quietly turned away from the window. Later that night, Alpha King Elric held a small council meeting inside the throne room. Only his most trusted advisors were present. A scout had just arrived from the southern territories. "They're gathering again," the scout reported. The king leaned back in his throne. "How many?" "Not enough for war," the scout said, "but enough that we should watch them carefully." The throne room grew quiet. King Elric looked toward the tall windows behind his throne. Outside, the full moon hung high above the kingdom. The Alpha King had lived long enough to understand something about peace. Peace never lasted forever. And inside the walls of Moonspire Citadel, life continued as it always had. The royal family ate together. The soldiers trained. The kingdom remained strong. But sometimes, the most important changes in a kingdom begin quietly, so quietly that no one notices them at first, not until it is far too late. Great. Life inside Moonspire Citadel did not slow down simply because the royal children had grown older. If anything, things became more serious. Now that Prince Alric and Kel were young men, their training was no longer treated like practice. The soldiers of the Citadel expected them to fight like real warriors, and Alpha King Alric expected even more. One cold morning before the sun had fully risen, the great horn of the castle sounded across the courtyards. Its deep echo rolled through the stone walls like distant thunder. Cal woke immediately. He had learned long ago that when the castle horn sounded at dawn, it meant only one thing: training. Real training. By the time he stepped into the courtyard, several soldiers had already gathered. Their armor reflected the pale morning light, and the air carried the sharp chill of early winter. At the center of the yard stood Captain Rowan. Beside him stood Prince Alric, and behind them, watching everything with silent authority, was the Alpha King himself. King Alric rarely came to the training yard this early. When he did, it meant the day would not be easy. Cal walked across the stone ground and stopped beside Alric. "You look like you didn't sleep," Alric whispered. "I slept enough," Cal replied. Alric smiled slightly. "That usually means Rowan is about to make us regret waking up." Captain Rowan stepped forward. "Today," he said loudly, "you will not train with wooden blades." Two soldiers walked forward carrying real swords. They placed them on the rack beside the training circle. The soldiers watching around the yard grew quiet. Training with real steel meant something different. It meant mistakes could hurt. Rowan looked directly at Kel and Alric. "You are no longer boys," he said. "If you wish to lead warriors one day, you must learn what real combat feels like." Cal picked up one of the swords. It felt heavier than the wooden weapons they normally used. Alric took the other. The two young men stepped into the center of the training circle. The soldiers formed a ring around them. Even Princess Alira, who had come to watch from the balcony above, leaned forward slightly. King Alric watched everything without speaking. Rowan raised his hand. "Begin." The fight started slowly. Both of them knew the danger of rushing in with a real steel. Their blades moved carefully at first. Strike, block, step back, strike again. The sound of metal clashing echoed across the courtyard. Kel attacked with fast, powerful strikes, pushing forward like a wolf testing its prey. Alric moved differently. He stayed calm, watching every movement, waiting for the right moment to respond. The fight grew faster. Steel rang against steel. Dust rose from the ground beneath their boots. The watching soldiers began to murmur quietly. Both fighters were skilled, very skilled. Suddenly, Kale stepped forward with a powerful swing aimed at Ulrich's side. Ulrich blocked it, but the force pushed him back 2 steps. Kale followed with another strike, then another. For a moment, it looked as if the prince might lose his balance, but Ulrich moved quickly. He turned his blade, deflected Kale's attack, and stepped around him. Their swords locked together. For a brief second, they stood face to face, both breathing hard. Then Rowan shouted, "Enough!" The two young men stepped back. The soldiers around them relaxed. Rowan walked into the circle and looked at both of them carefully. "You fight well," he said. That was the closest thing to praise the captain ever gave. As the soldiers began to leave the yard, King Ulric finally stepped forward. His presence alone made the remaining warriors straighten immediately. The Alpha King looked first at Ulric, then at Kale. "You both have strength," he said. His voice was calm but powerful. "But strength alone does not win wars." Neither of them spoke. The king continued. A true alpha understands more than battle. He understands loyalty, he understands patience, and he understands the weight of protecting his pack. His eyes rested briefly on Kale. Then he turned away. Training ends for today. With that, the Alpha King left the courtyard. Later that evening, Kale sat alone in the lower gardens of the citadel. The moon had already risen above the castle towers. He rested against the stone wall, quietly sharpening his sword. Footsteps approached. Kale looked up. It was Prince Ulrich. The prince sat down beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ulrich chuckled softly. I think father enjoyed watching that fight. Kale smirked. He always enjoys watching us suffer. Ulrich laughed. For a while, they simply sat there, looking up at the moon above the citadel, like they had done many times when they were younger. Two young warriors, raised under the same roof, trained by the same soldiers, living inside the same kingdom. And neither of them knew that the peaceful nights of Moonspire Citadel would not last forever. In the kingdom of Valdrin, there was a tradition older than the citadel itself. Every young wolf of royal blood had to prove their strength in the moon hunt. It was not just a hunt for animals. It was a test of courage, patience, instinct, and control. Only those who passed the moon hunt were truly considered warriors of the pack. And now the time had come for Prince Ulrich and Kyle. The morning of the hunt arrived cold and quiet. Mist covered the forest that stretched beneath Moonspire Citadel, and the tall trees looked like dark shadows against the pale sky. Soldiers gathered near the great gates of the castle. Several horses were prepared. Weapons were checked. At the front stood Captain Rowan giving final instructions. "This is not a game," he said firmly. "The forest is wild. Wolves hunt there. Beasts hunt there." His eyes moved between Kyle and Ulrich. "You will rely on your instincts." The young men nodded. From the balcony above, Princess Elira watched the preparations carefully. She leaned on the stone railing, her expression serious. Beside her stood Queen Selene. "They'll be fine," the queen said calmly. Elira didn't answer immediately. "I know," she said finally. Still, she continued watching until the castle gates slowly opened. The forest outside Valdrin was deep and ancient. Tall trees stretched toward the sky, their branches forming thick shadows over the ground. The air smelled of pine, damp earth, and cold river water. Kyle rode beside Ulrich as they followed Rowan along the narrow path. Several experienced hunters accompanied them, but once they reached the heart of the forest, the soldiers would stay behind. From that point, the hunt would belong to the two young wolves. After nearly an hour of riding, Rowan finally stopped. "This is where you continue alone," he said. He pointed toward the deeper forest. "Find your prey, track it, bring it down." Ulrich nodded. Kyle simply stepped down from his horse. The two young men gathered their weapons and began walking into the forest. The sound of the soldiers slowly faded behind them. Soon the forest was silent. They walked carefully. Every sound mattered. A broken branch, the movement of leaves, the distant cry of birds. Kale crouched near the ground, studying a set of tracks in the dirt. "Deer," he said. Elric looked at the marks. "You're sure?" Kale nodded. "They passed not long ago." The prince smiled slightly. "Then let's follow them." They moved deeper into the forest. The tracks led them across a shallow stream and up a rocky hill covered with moss. Suddenly, Kale raised his hand. Elric stopped immediately. Both of them listened. There it was, a low sound moving through the trees. Not a deer, something heavier, something bigger. Kale slowly reached for his sword. The bushes ahead moved, and then the creature stepped into view. It was a shadow bear, one of the most dangerous beasts in the northern forests. The massive animal stood nearly as tall as a man when it rose on its hind legs. Its dark fur blended with the shadows of the forest. Elric whispered quietly, "Well, that's not a deer." Kale almost smiled. The bear growled. The hunt had just become far more dangerous. The beast charged. Its massive paws slammed against the ground as it rushed forward. Kale moved first. He stepped aside quickly, slashing his blade across the bear's shoulder. The creature roared. Elric attacked from the other side, striking toward its leg. The bear swung its claws wildly. One strike barely missed Kale's chest. The fight turned brutal. The forest echoed with the sounds of claws, steel, and angry growls. Finally, after several long moments, Kale saw an opening. "Now!" he shouted. Elric lunged forward. His blade struck deep into the creature's side. The bear staggered. Kale delivered the final blow. The beast collapsed heavily onto the forest floor. Silence returned. Both young men stood there breathing hard. Ulrich wiped sweat from his forehead. "That was not the hunt I expected." Kale laughed quietly. "But we survived." By the time they returned to Moonspire's citadel, the sun was already setting. The soldiers gathered near the gates, cheering when they saw the massive bear carried behind them. Captain Rowan nodded with approval. "Not bad for your first moon hunt." Above the gates, Princess Elira smiled in relief. The young wolves of the citadel had proven themselves. But high above the courtyard, inside the towers of the castle, Elfa King Elric watched the celebration silently. His sharp eyes studied the two young warriors below, the prince and the boy he had brought from the battlefield many years ago. For a long moment, the king said nothing. Then he turned and walked back into the shadows of the castle. After the moon hunt, life in Moonspire Citadel began to feel different. Not in a loud or obvious way, but people noticed. The soldiers spoke about it quietly among themselves. The castle servants whispered about it when they passed through the long stone halls. The two young men who had returned from the forest were no longer seen as boys. They were now warriors of the back. The Alpha King had made sure of that. A few days after the hunt, Kale was summoned to the throne room. When the message arrived, he was in the training yard sharpening his blade. "His Majesty wishes to see you," the guard said. Kale wiped the dust from his hands and nodded. He had spoken with the king before, but being called to the throne room alone was unusual. The walk through the castle corridors felt longer than usual. Torches burned along the walls, casting long shadows across the stone floors. Guards stood at attention as he passed. Finally, the large doors of the throne room opened. Inside, the hall was quiet. At the far end sat King Eric, the Alpha King of Valdrin, upon his great stone throne. The king's presence filled the room even when he said nothing. Kel walked forward and stopped several steps below the throne. "You sent for me, my king." Eric studied him for a moment. Then he spoke. "You fought well in the forest." Kel lowered his head slightly. "Thank you, my king." The king leaned forward a little. "That bear could have killed you both." Kale gave a small nod. "It could have, but it didn't," the king said. Silence filled the room again. Then Eric stood. When the Alpha King stood, it always felt like the entire hall grew heavier. He walked slowly down the steps of the throne. "You've grown strong," he said. Kale said nothing. The king stopped in front of him. "Do you know why I brought you back from that battlefield all those years ago?" Kale hesitated. "No, my king." The king looked at him carefully. "For many years I wondered the same thing." Kale blinked in surprise. The king gave a quiet breath. "I have seen many warriors in my life, many strong wolves, many brave ones." He placed a heavy hand on Kale's shoulder. "But sometimes instinct tells you something that your mind cannot explain." Kale looked up slightly. The king's eyes were steady. I trusted that instinct, Eirik said. For a moment, Kale didn't know what to say. The Alpha King stepped back. You are part of this pack now, he said simply. Those words meant more than any title. In the world of wolves, belonging to the Alpha's pack was everything. Later that evening, Kael found Prince Alaric in the training yard. The prince was practicing sword strikes against the wooden posts. He stopped when he saw Kael approach. So, Alaric said, Father called you to the throne room? Kael raised an eyebrow. How did you know? Alaric shrugged. Word travels fast in a castle. Kael leaned against the wooden fence. He said I fought well in the forest. Alaric laughed. That's practically a speech coming from him. Kael smirked. You are not wrong. Alaric wiped sweat from his forehead. Father has always trusted his instincts, the prince said after a moment. Kael nodded slowly. So it seems. High above them, from one of the balconies, Princess Illyra watched the two young men talking in the yard below. She had known them her entire life. To her, they had always been brothers. Different in many ways, but bound together by the same home. She leaned against the stone railing and smiled slightly as she watched them. But somewhere deep inside the ancient walls of Moonspire Citadel, something had begun to shift. Not loudly, not violently, just quietly, like a shadow moving where no one thought to look, and no one in the castle yet understood how much would soon change. For many years, Moonspire's citadel had stood as a symbol of strength. Its walls had survived wars, rebellions, and harsh winters that had broken weaker kingdoms. The people of Valdren believed their fortress could withstand almost anything. Inside those walls lived the Alpha King, his family, and the warriors who protected the realm. And because of that, most people believed the citadel was the safest place in the kingdom. But sometimes danger does not come from outside the walls. Sometimes it waits quietly within them. The night it happened began like any other. The castle halls were calm. Servants carried lanterns through the corridors as they finished their work for the day. Guards changed shifts at the gates and along the towers. The moon hung high above the citadel, lighting the courtyard with pale silver light. Most of the castle had already gone to sleep, but a few people were still awake. In the lower training yard, Kael remained long after the other soldiers had left. He often trained late at night. The quiet helped him think. His blade moved steadily through the air as he practiced the forms Captain Rowan had taught him years before. Strike, turn, block, strike again. The only sound in the yard was the soft scrape of steel and the distant wind brushing against the towers. After a while, Kael lowered his sword and wiped the sweat from his forehead. He was about to leave when he noticed something. Movement. Far above the yard, on one of the upper walkways, a shadow passed quickly across the stone wall. Kael found that part of the citadel led toward the royal chambers. He stood still, watching, but the shadow disappeared. After a moment, he shook his head. Probably just a guard finishing a patrol. Still, something about it felt strange. Elsewhere in the castle, Prince Alaric sat in his study chamber. A map of the northern territories lay open across his desk. Several small candles burned beside, lighting the room with a warm glow. The prince studied the map carefully. The southern borders of the kingdom had been unusually quiet lately. Too quiet. His father had noticed it too. And when the Alpha King noticed something, it usually meant trouble was coming. Alaric leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. It had been a long day. After a moment, he stood and blew out the candles. The room fell into darkness. High in the royal wing of the castle, Queen Selene walked slowly through the hallway toward her chambers. The castle had grown very quiet. Only the faint footsteps of distant guards could be heard. She paused for a moment beside one of the large windows. Outside, the moon lit the valley below. Valdren looked peaceful, safe. The queen smiled softly to herself before continuing down the hall. Not long after midnight, The silence of the citadel was broken. A scream echoed through the castle corridors, then another. Guards rushed from their posts. Doors flew open as servants and soldiers ran into the halls. Within moments, the entire fortress had awakened. "What happened?" someone shouted. "The king!" another voice cried. "The Alpha King!" Kyle heard the shouting as he stepped back into the castle from the training yard. He immediately began running toward the royal wing. Soldiers were already racing through the corridors. Something was terribly wrong. When Kyle reached the upper halls, he saw a group of guards gathered outside the king's chamber. Captain Rowan stood among them. His face looked grim. Kyle pushed through the crowd. "What happened?" he asked. No one answered at first. Then Rowan stepped aside. The door to the chamber stood open. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single lantern, and on the floor, near the bed, lay King Alaric, the Alpha King of Valdrin. He was not moving. Kyle froze. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Then Rowan spoke quietly. "The king is dead." The words echoed heavily in the room. Around them, the guards looked stunned. No one in the castle had ever imagined such a thing could happen. The Alpha King murdered inside his own fortress. Rowan's eyes moved slowly across the room. "This chamber was sealed," he said. "No one enters the royal wing at night without being seen." The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. Something about this did not make sense. Rowan turned toward the doorway. "Lock down the castle," he ordered. "No one leaves Moonspire Citadel." Kyle stood silently near the doorway, staring at the fallen king. Only hours earlier, Alaric had been alive, strong, unshakable. Now he was gone, and somewhere inside the castle walls, the one responsible was still there. By morning, the entire kingdom of Valdrin had heard the news. The Alpha King was dead. The bells of Moonspire Citadel rang slowly across the valley, their deep sound echoing through the mountains like a long cry of mourning. In the villages below the citadel, people stepped outside their homes and looked toward the great fortress on the hill. Many of them could hardly believe it. King Eric had ruled for many years. He had been strong, fearless, a leader who had defended the kingdom through war and hardship. To imagine the citadel without him felt almost impossible. But the bells did not lie. The Alpha King was gone. Inside the castle, the mood had turned heavy. The halls that were once filled with the sounds of daily life were now quiet and tense. Guards stood at every entrance. Servants moved carefully, speaking in low voices. Captain Rowan had ordered the entire citadel locked down until they understood what had happened. No one entered, no one left. The murderer had to be somewhere inside the walls. In the throne room, the royal court had gathered. The body of King Eric had been prepared according to the ancient traditions of Valdrin. His sword rested across his chest as he lay upon a stone platform beneath the banners of the kingdom. Soldiers stood in silent rows along the walls. Some of them had fought beside the king for decades. Many of them lowered their heads in respect. At the front of the hall stood Queen Selene, her expression calm but pale. Beside her stood Prince Eric. The young prince looked different now. Only a day earlier, he had simply been the king's son. Now he stood as the future Alpha King of Valdrin. Responsibility had come to him suddenly, and everyone in the room could feel it. Near the back of the hall stood Cale. His arms were folded tightly as he looked toward the fallen king. For a long moment, he said nothing. Memories filled his mind. The day the king had brought him to the citadel, the years of training, the quiet conversations in the throne room, the trust the Alpha King had shown him. Cale felt a deep weight settle in his chest. Whoever had done this, whoever had taken the life of the king, they had also broken something inside the kingdom. Captain Rowan stepped forward to address the court. "We're still investigating," he said firmly. "The king's chambers showed signs of struggle, Murmurs moved through the hall. Rowan continued. The guards stationed near the royal wing reported nothing unusual during the night. Someone in the court spoke up. How was that possible? Rowan's expression hardened. That is exactly what we are trying to determine. Later that day, the questioning began. Every guard who had been on duty during the night was brought forward. Servants who worked in the royal wing were also questioned. Where had they been? What had they seen? Had they heard anything unusual? But the answers were always the same. Nothing. No screams, no footsteps, no signs that anyone had entered or left the king's chamber. It was as if the murder had happened in complete silence. By evening, frustration had begun to spread through the castle. Captain Rowan stood in the war chamber, reviewing reports with several soldiers. "This makes no sense," one of them said. "The guards swear no one passed through the corridor." Rowan rubbed his beard thoughtfully. "Someone did," he said. "They had to." Elsewhere in the citadel, whispers had already begun spreading. Some people believed the killer had come from outside the castle. Others believed the murderer had to be someone who knew the citadel well, someone who could move through the fortress without being noticed. The rumors grew more dangerous as the day went on, and before long, a few of those whispers began to circle around a particular name. Cale, the boy who had been brought from an enemy battlefield, the outsider raised inside the Alpha's house, the warrior who had trained late in the courtyard on the very night the king had died. Cale first heard the rumor from a young soldier in the training yard. The man looked nervous when Cale approached. "What are people saying?" Cale asked calmly. The soldier hesitated. Then he sighed. "They're saying you're the last person awake in the courtyard." Cale stared at him for a moment. "And?" The soldier swallowed. "Some of them think maybe you went up to the royal wing." Silence settled between them. Cale said nothing for several seconds. Finally, he spoke. "You don't believe that?" The soldier shook his head quickly. "No, of course not." But his voice did not sound completely certain. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, Prince Eric stood alone in the throne room. The great hall felt larger now, empty. Without the presence of the Alpha King, the throne seemed strangely heavy. Eric slowly placed his hand on the arm of the throne. He did not sit, not yet. Instead, he looked toward the large doors of the hall. Footsteps echoed behind him. Eric turned. It was Cale. The two young men looked at each other across the silent room. For years they had stood side by side as brothers, but now the castle was filled with suspicion, and something had changed in the air between them. Not anger, not yet, but something else, something uncertain, something neither of them fully understood. Outside the citadel, the wind moved across the dark forests of Aldrin, and deep inside the castle walls, the truth about the king's death remained hidden. The days following the death of the Alpha King grew darker inside Moonspire Citadel. What had first been confusion slowly turned into suspicion, and suspicion, when left alone long enough, always looks for someone to blame. At first, the soldiers whispered quietly among themselves, but whispers have a strange way of growing louder. Soon, the name on everyone's lips was the same: Cale. The adopted son, the outsider the king had brought back from a battlefield years ago. It began in small ways. A guard who stopped talking when Cale entered a room, a servant who quickly lowered their eyes and walked away, soldiers in the training yard who suddenly ended their conversation when he approached. Cale noticed all of it. He said nothing, but he understood what it meant. Captain Rowan tried to keep order. "The investigation is not finished," he reminded the soldiers again and again. "No one is guilty until we have proof." But proof was exactly what the frightened kingdom wanted, and fear makes people impatient. One afternoon, Kale walked through the lower courtyard when two soldiers began arguing nearby. "I'm telling you," one said in a hushed voice, "he was the last one awake that night." "That doesn't mean anything," the other replied. "Then why did he train so late?" Kale stopped walking. The men quickly fell silent. Neither of them could meet his eyes. Kale continued walking without saying a word, but the weight in his chest grew heavier. Later that evening, Prince Ulrich found him standing alone on one of the high balconies of the citadel. The sun was setting beyond the mountains, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and red. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ulrich stepped closer. "You've heard what they're saying," the prince said quietly. Kale nodded. "Yes." Ulrich leaned against the stone railing. "People are frightened. They want answers." Kale gave a faint, tired smile. "And I'm the easiest answer." Ulrich didn't reply. The wind moved through the balcony, carrying the distant sounds of the castle below. For a moment, it almost felt like the old days again. But the silence between them was different now, heavier. That night, the rumors finally reached the royal council. Some of the nobles demanded action. "If the adopted son is innocent, then let him prove it." Another added sharply, "The kingdom cannot allow a possible murderer to walk freely inside the citadel." Queen Celine listened quietly. Prince Ulrich stood beside her. Captain Rowan argued strongly against the accusations. "We have no evidence," he said firmly. But the council was restless. Fear had already begun to spread through the kingdom. The next morning, Kale made a decision. Before the council could place him under guard, before the whispers could turn into chains, he left. Just before sunrise, while most of the castle still slept, Kale packed a small bag and slipped quietly through the outer gate. He did not run like a criminal. He simply walked away from the citadel that had been his home for most of his life. Behind him, the great towers of Moonspire Citadel rose against the pale morning sky. Kale stopped once and looked back. Memories flooded his mind. The training yards, the long halls, the throne room where the Alpha King had once sat, the home he had known for years. Then he turned and continued down the mountain road. By midday, the castle guards discovered he was gone, and by mid-evening, the order was given. Kale was a now wanted man. Across the kingdom of Valdrin, riders carried the news. The adopted son of the Alpha King had escaped, and many believed that meant only one thing: the murderer had escaped.
For weeks, Kale traveled alone. He moved through forests, quiet villages, and empty mountain paths, always staying far away from the main roads. Everywhere he went, he heard the same story. The Alpha King had been murdered, and the adopted son had disappeared. Many people believed Kale had run because he was guilty, but Kale knew the truth. He had not killed the king, and the thought that someone else had taken the life of the man who raised him burned inside his chest like fire. One night, while hiding in an abandoned stone tower deep in the northern hills, Kale sat beside a dying fire. Sleep would not come. His mind kept returning to the same question: who had killed the Alpha King, and why? As the fire crackled softly, Kale remembered something strange, something the king had once shown him years earlier: a hidden chamber beneath the citadel, a place filled with strange machines and ancient devices. The king had rarely spoken about them, but Kale remembered one machine in particular, a machine that the king once described as an experiment with time itself. At the time, Kale had thought it was nothing more than an old invention that never worked, but now a thought began to grow in his mind. Days later, under the cover of darkness, Kale returned to Moonspire Citadel. He did not enter through the main gates. Instead,
He used an old tunnel beneath the outer walls, a secret passage the Alpha King had once shown him long ago. The castle above was quiet. Guards still searched for him, but none of them expected him to return. Moving carefully through the underground halls, Kale finally reached the hidden chamber. The room looked exactly as he remembered. Strange metal structures filled the space. Old gears, glass tubes, ancient mechanisms, and in the center of the chamber stood the machine, the time device. Dust covered most of its surface, but the large circular frame still stood tall. Kale stared at it for a long moment. If the machine truly worked, if it could take him back to the past, then maybe, just maybe, he could stop the king's death before it ever happened. With careful hands, Kale began examining the machine. It took hours. Many of the parts were old. Some had to be repaired, others needed to be reset. But slowly, the machine began to come alive. Lights flickered faintly inside the metal rings. The air in the chamber vibrated softly. Kale stepped inside the center of the device. His heart pounded. If this worked, he would return to the night of the king's murder, and this time, he would stop it. The road north of Valdrin was cold and lonely. Winter had not yet arrived, but the wind already carried the sharp bite of the coming season. The trees along the mountain paths had begun to lose their leaves, and the forests had grown quiet. Through those empty roads walked a man who once lived in a castle. Now he walked alone. That man was Kale. It had been several weeks since he left Moonspire Citadel. Several weeks since the kingdom he once called home had turned against him. Everywhere he went, the same story followed him. The Alpha King was dead, and the adopted son had disappeared the very morning after. For many people, that was enough to decide the truth. In the eyes of the kingdom, Kale was no longer a loyal warrior. He was a murderer who had fled. Kale kept his hood low as he walked through a small village near the northern forests. The villagers barely noticed him. Travelers were not uncommon along the trade paths. Still, Kale did not stay long. He bought a piece of bread from an old merchant, filled his water pouch, and continued walking. He had learned to move quickly, to stay nowhere too long. Not because he feared being captured, but because he could not bear hearing the whispers. The whispers hurt more than the cold. That night he stopped in an abandoned hunting cabin deep in the woods. The small wooden building leaned slightly to one side, its roof worn from years of snow and rain. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old wood. Kale lit a small fire and sat beside it quietly. The flames flickered against the walls. For a long time he said nothing. His thoughts were heavy. They always returned to the same night, the night the Alpha King died. Kale closed his eyes. He could still see the chamber clearly. The broken furniture, the blood on the stone floor, the king lying motionless. That image had followed him ever since. And the worst part was the question that refused to leave his mind. Who had done it? Kale knew one thing with absolute certainty. It had not been him. But knowing the truth inside his own heart did not change what the kingdom believed. To them, his disappearance looked like guilt. Maybe running away had been a mistake. Maybe he should have stayed and fought the accusations. But something deep inside him had told him the truth would never be found that way. Whoever had killed the king had done it carefully, quietly, without leaving a trace. It was the work of someone who understood the castle well, someone who knew the guards, someone who knew the king's routines, someone who could move inside the citadel without being questioned. That thought had troubled Kale for many nights, because the more he thought about it, the more dangerous the truth began to feel. The fire beside him crackled softly.
Kale stared into the flames as another memory surfaced. A strange memory. Something the king had once shown him long ago. A hidden chamber beneath Moonspire Citadel. A place few people in the kingdom even knew existed. Inside that chamber had been many strange devices, ancient machines, tools the king said were left behind by scholars who once studied things beyond ordinary understanding. At the time, Kale had barely paid attention. Most of the machines had looked broken, old, forgotten. But there had been one machine that the king had spoken about with unusual interest, a large metal structure shaped like a circle. It had been filled with glass tubes, rotating rings, and strange markings carved into the metal. Kale remembered the king standing beside it, smiling slightly. "This," the king had said, resting his hand on the metal frame, "is an experiment with time itself." Kale had laughed then. "A time machine?" he had asked. The king had shrugged. "Perhaps. But no one has ever been able to make it work." Kale slowly opened his eyes. The firelight flickered across his face. For several seconds, he sat completely still. Then he whispered quietly to himself. "A machine that controls time." At first, the idea sounded impossible, but the more he thought about it, the more the thought refused to leave his mind. What if the machine actually worked? What if it could take someone back to the past, back to the moment before the king was killed, back to the night when everything changed? Kale felt his heart begin to beat faster. If such a thing were possible, then there would be a way to uncover the truth, a way to see the killer with his own eyes, a way to stop the murder before it ever happened. Kale stood up slowly. The fire behind him crackled softly. For weeks he had been running without direction. Now, for the first time since leaving the Citadel, he had a purpose. He needed to return to Moonspire Citadel. Not to surrender, not to fight the soldiers, but to reach the hidden chamber beneath the castle, to find the strange machine the king had once shown him, and to test the one impossible chance that might change everything. Outside the cabin, the wind moved through the trees. The night sky above the forest was dark, but the moon shone brightly through the clouds. Kale pulled his cloak tighter and stepped onto the path again. Behind him, the small fire slowly burned itself out. Ahead of him waited the long road back to the Citadel, back to the kingdom that now believed it was its greatest traitor. But Kale no longer cared what they believed, because if the machine worked, if time itself could be turned backward, then the truth about the Alpha King's death would finally be revealed. And when that moment came, everything would change.
The journey back to Moonspire Citadel took several days. Cal avoided the main roads and moved mostly through the forests and narrow mountain paths. The kingdom had already sent riders across many regions searching for him, and the last thing he wanted was to walk straight into one of their patrols. By day, he stayed hidden among thick trees or abandoned farm buildings. By night, he traveled. The cold winds followed him across the mountains, but Cal barely noticed them. His mind remained fixed on one single thought: the machine, the strange device the Alpha King had once shown him. For years, Cal had believed it was nothing more than a curious invention that never worked. Now, it might be the only thing capable of revealing the truth. 3 nights later, the tall towers of Moonspire Citadel appeared on the horizon. Even from far away, the fortress looked powerful. Massive stone walls surrounded the mountain peak, and tall watchtowers stood like silent guardians beneath the moonlight. For a moment, Cal stopped walking. Seeing the citadel again stirred something painful inside him. That place had been his home. The place where he had grown from a frightened child into a warrior. The place where the Alpha King had given him a second life. Now, the same fortress believed he had murdered the man who saved him. Kale tightened his cloak and continued forward. He had not returned to defend himself. He had returned for something far more important. He waited until deep into the night before approaching the outer walls. Moonspire Citadel was heavily guarded, especially after the king's death. Torches burned along the battlements, and guards walked carefully along the walls. But Kale knew something most of the soldiers did not. There were older parts of the fortress, passages built long before the current walls existed, hidden tunnels, secret paths used during ancient wars, and one of those tunnels led directly beneath the castle. The entrance was hidden deep within the forest on the northern side of the mountain. Most people believed it had collapsed years ago, but Cal knew better. He pushed aside a cluster of thick vines and stepped into a narrow opening between two large stones. Cold air rushed from inside the tunnel. The passage smelled of damp earth and old stone. Cal lit a small torch and began walking. The tunnel stretched deep beneath the mountain. Water dripped slowly from the ceiling. Small echoes followed each step he took. Cale had not walked this path in years, but his memory guided him easily through the darkness. After several minutes, the tunnel widened into a narrow stone corridor. At the far end stood a heavy iron door, the same door the king had once opened for him, the door that led to the hidden chamber. Cale pushed it slowly. The metal groaned as it opened. Inside, the chamber looked almost exactly as he remembered. The room was large and circular, carved deep into the rock beneath the citadel. Strange machines stood everywhere. Some were broken beyond repair. Others were covered in thick layers of dust. Gears, pipes, glass tubes, and metal frames filled the room like the forgotten workshop of a long-dead inventor. But Cale's eyes immediately found the one machine he had come for, the time device. It stood in the center of the chamber. A massive ring of dark metal surrounded a raised platform. Several smaller rings were connected around it, each covered with strange symbols carved into the surface. Long glass tubes stretched along the sides, filled with faded blue crystals that once glowed with energy. Now the machine looked silent, lifeless, forgotten. Cale stepped closer. He placed his hands against the cold metal frame. "This better work," he murmured quietly. For a moment he simply stood there, remembering the king's voice. "It is only a fairy," the king had said long ago, "a device meant to bend time itself." Cale had laughed at the idea back then. Now he desperately hoped the king had been right. The machine clearly had not been used in years. Dust covered the control levers. Some wires had loosened. One of the glass tubes had cracked slightly along its side. Cale began examining the device carefully. He had spent years training as a warrior, but the king had also taught him many other things: how machines worked, how to repair broken tools, how to understand the strange inventions hidden beneath the citadel. Slowly, piece by piece, Cale began fixing the device. He tightened loose gears, reconnected broken wires, replaced cracked crystal tubes with spare ones stored nearby. The work took hours. At several points, Cale wondered if he was wasting his time, but he kept going, because if the machine truly worked, everything could change. Finally, as he adjusted the final lever, something happened. A soft humming sound filled the chamber. Cale stepped back quickly. The metal rings surrounding the platform began to move, slowly at first, then faster. A faint blue glow spread through the glass tubes. The machine was waking up. Cale's heart began to race. "It's working," he whispered. The humming sound grew louder. Energy flowed through the device like lightning trapped inside glass. The large metal rings began spinning around the platform. Air rushed through the chamber. The entire room vibrated. Cale stared at the center platform. This was it. If the king's theory had been correct, stepping into that machine could send him backward through time, back to the night of the king's murder, back to the moment where everything had gone wrong. For a moment, Cale hesitated. Changing time was not something anyone should attempt lightly.
No one knew what might happen. No one knew if it could even work. But Cale had already lost everything: his home, his name, his honor. The only thing left was the truth, and the truth waited somewhere in the past. Cale stepped onto the center platform. The spinning rings moved faster now. Light filled the chamber. The air felt heavy with energy. Cale gripped the metal rail beside him and took one deep breath. "If this works," he said quietly, "I will find the one who killed you." The machine roared with power. The light exploded around him, and in the next instant, the world vanished.
For a moment, Cale felt nothing. No ground beneath his feet, no air in his lungs, only light, blinding light swirling around him like a storm of silver flames. The sound of the machine roared in his ears, louder than thunder, until suddenly, everything stopped. Cale collapsed to one knee. Cold stone pressed against his hand. The humming sound of the machine faded slowly behind him. For several seconds he stayed there, breathing heavily, trying to steady himself. Then he lifted his head. The chamber around him looked the same. The same circular stone walls, the same strange machines, the same metal rings surrounding the platform. But something was different. The dust that once covered the machines was gone. The metal looked polished, clean. The glass tubes glowed brightly with fresh blue energy. Cale slowly stood up. His heart pounded in his chest. "It worked," he whispered. The machine had taken him back. He moved quickly toward the iron door and pushed it open. The tunnel outside was brighter than before. Torches burned along the walls. They had not been there earlier. Cale stepped into the corridor and walked toward the staircase that led up into the citadel. Each step made his heart beat faster. He had returned to the past, to the night before the king died. If he moved quickly enough, if he reached the royal wing in time, he could stop the murder before it ever happened. Cale climbed the staircase 2 steps at a time. The sounds of the castle grew clearer as he approached the upper halls. Voices, footsteps, the distant clang of metal from the training yard. Everything was alive again. The citadel had not yet fallen into the silence of tragedy. For a moment, Cale felt something strange. Relief. The castle looked exactly the way it had before everything went wrong. Servants passed through the corridors carrying lanterns. Guards stood watch along the hallways. None of them noticed Cale moving quickly through the shadows. To them, he was simply another soldier moving through the castle. They had no idea that the man walking past them had already lived through the future. Cale moved toward the royal wing. He remembered the path clearly, every hallway, every stairway, every turn in the corridor. He had walked these halls thousands of times growing up in the citadel, but tonight each step felt heavier because he knew what was waiting ahead. Somewhere inside those halls, the Alpha King would soon die, unless Cale could stop it. Cale pushed forward through them. "What happened?" he asked. None of the soldiers stopped him. None of them even seemed to notice him. Their attention was focused entirely on the room. Cale stepped into the chamber, and his heart stopped. The Alpha King lay on the floor, exactly the way Cale remembered, the same position, the same blood on the stone, the same terrible silence filling the room. Cale staggered backward. "No," he whispered. "No, that's not possible." He had returned to the cast. He had run as fast as he could, and yet he had still arrived too late. The guards began shouting for Captain Rowan. Servants rushed through the halls in panic. The castle was beginning to fall into the same chaos Cale remembered from the future. But Cale barely heard any of it. His mind was spinning. How could this have happened? He had come back in time. He should have arrived before the murder. He should have had time to stop it. Unless he had not gone back far enough. Cale slowly backed out of the chamber. The noise of the castle grew louder behind him, but he ignored it. Instead, he turned and ran back through the corridors, down the stairways, through the hidden passage, back toward the underground chamber. When he reached the machine again, Cale leaned against the metal frame, breathing heavily. The machine was still active. The crystals glowed softly. Energy hummed through the rings. Cale stared at it for a long moment. He understood now. He had returned to the past, but not early enough. The murder had already happened before he reached the chamber. That meant he needed to go further back into the night, to a moment before the killer ever reached the king. Kale stepped onto the platform again. This time, there was no hesitation. He pulled the lever. The rings began to spinning once more. Lights filled the chamber. The machine roared to life, and Kale traveled through time again. The second return felt even stranger than the first. When the light faded, Kale ran immediately toward the castle halls. He moved faster this time. He avoided the mean corridors. He cut through side passages and stairways. Everything depended on reaching the royal chamber early. But when he arrived, the result was the same. The king was already dead. Kale tried again and again and again. Each time he returned a little earlier. Each time he ran a little faster. Each time he believed he would finally arrive before the attack happened. But every attempt ended the same way. The chamber door already open, the guards already gathering, the Alpha King already dead. It was as if the moment refused to change, as if time itself was protecting the murder. After many attempts, Kale stood once more inside the hidden chamber. His body was exhausted. His mind felt heavier than ever. How, he whispered to himself, how is this possible? No matter how many times he travels back, the king always died before he reached the chamber, which meant something important, something Kale had not yet considered. The killer was moving earlier than Kale expected, earlier than anyone would normally think, earlier than the moment the body was discovered. And if Kale wanted to see the truth, he needed to go back even further back into the night, to a moment before the killer ever reached the king. Kale stepped onto the platform again. This time, there was no hesitation. He pulled the lever. The rings began to spinning once more. Light filled the chamber, the machine roared to life, and Kale traveled through time again. This time, Kale chose to go further back than he ever had before. Much further. When the machine roared to life again, the spinning rings glowed brighter than before, and the air inside the hidden chamber felt heavier with power. Kale held on to the metal rail as the light swallowed the room. His body felt as if it were being pulled through a rushing river. Then suddenly, silence. The humming faded. The light disappeared. Kale opened his eyes. He was standing inside the hidden chamber once again, but the difference was obvious immediately. The torches in the hallway outside the chamber burned brighter. Voices echoed faintly through the corridors above. The castle was still fully awake. Kale had gone back much earlier in the night. Exactly what he needed. He stepped off the platform slowly. This time, he would not rush straight to the royal chamber. That had been his mistake before. Instead, he needed to watch, to wait, to see the truth unfold. Because somewhere inside this castle, someone was already planning the murder of the Alpha King. Kale moved quietly through the underground tunnel and climbed the narrow stone staircase that led into the citadel. The moment he stepped into the main halls, he could feel the life of the castle around him. Servants moved through the corridors carrying trays of food. Soldiers laughed in the distance. Somewhere below, metal clanged as warriors finished their training in the yard. It was still evening, hours before midnight, hours before the moment when everything would go wrong. Kale walked through the halls carefully, keeping to the shadows. Many of the people he passed greeted him normally. None of them knew he had already lived through the future. To them, this was just another ordinary night inside Moonspire Citadel. That thought alone made Kale's chest feel heavy. If he failed again, this peaceful night would still end in tragedy. As the evening slowly passed, the castle began to quiet. The servants finished their work and disappeared into the lower quarters. The torches along the corridors burned lower, guards changed shifts, and the deep silence of midnight slowly settled over the fortress. Kale moved toward the royal wing, but this time, instead of approaching the king's chamber directly, He hid in a dark corner of the hallway, far enough away that no one would notice him. From there, he could see the door clearly, and he could wait. Time moved slowly. The castle was nearly silent now. Only the distant footsteps of guards echoed through the halls. Kale remained still. His eyes never left the king's chamber door. Minutes passed, then more minutes. For moments, Kale wondered if perhaps this attempt would fail just like the others. But then, footsteps. Soft, careful, coming from the far end of the corridor. Kale's body tensed. Someone was approaching. The figure moved slowly through the dim torchlight. Their cloak covered most of their body, but their steps were confident, not the nervous steps of an intruder. These were the steps of someone who belonged in the royal wing, someone who knew the castle well, someone who would not be stopped by guards. Carol leaned forward slightly, trying to see the face hidden beneath the hood. The figure reached the king's chamber door. For a brief moment, they paused. Then they pushed the door open and stepped inside. Kale waited only a few seconds before moving silently toward the doorway. His heart pounded harder with every step. He reached the door and looked inside, and in that moment, the truth finally revealed itself. Standing inside the chamber was Prince Ulrich, the king's biological son, the crown prince of Valdrin. Kale froze. His breath caught in his throat. For years he had fought beside Ulrich,
Trained with him, laughed with him, trusted him like a brother. And yet, here he was, standing inside the king's chamber in the middle of the night, holding a blade. The Alpha King looked up from the table near his bed. His expression showed mild surprise. "Ulrich," the king said calmly, "what brings you here so late?" For a brief moment, the prince said nothing. He simply stood there. Then slowly he stepped forward. The torchlight revealed his face clearly now. His expression was cold, focused, nothing like the calm and noble prince the kingdom believed him to be. Kale felt his stomach tighten. Everything made sense now. The perfect plan, the careful silence, the way suspicion had quickly fallen on him. Ulrich had planned it all. The prince pulled a blade from beneath his cloak. The king's eyes widened slightly. "Ulrich, what are you doing?" The prince's voice was low. "You have ruled long enough, father." Kale felt rage explode inside him, but he forced himself to stay hidden. He needed to understand everything first. The prince continued speaking. "You built this kingdom on fear," Ulrich said quietly. "But fear is not enough anymore." The king straightened slowly. "You would murder your own father for the throne?" Ulrich's grip on the blade tightened. "For the future of Valdrin." Kale stepped back into the shadows. His heart felt like it was breaking inside his chest. The truth had finally been revealed. The one responsible for everything. The death of the king, the fall of the kingdom, the false accusations against Kale. All of it had come from the same person, Prince Ulrich. Kale turned and moved quietly down the corridor. He did not interfere this time. He had seen enough. Now he understood. If he tried to stop the prince at this exact moment, the outcome might still be uncertain. But now that he knew the truth, he did change everything. Kale returned to the hidden chamber beneath the citadel. The machine still hummed softly, waiting. He stepped onto the platform once more. This time, his decision was clear. He would reset the night again. But this time, he would arrive before Ulrich reached the chamber, before the blade was drawn, before the king ever realized danger was near. And when that moment came, Kale would face the prince himself, even if it meant fighting the man he once called brother, even if it meant spilling royal blood. The machine roared once more. Light filled the chamber, and Kale prepared for the final return, because the next time he arrived in the past, the fate of the Alpha King would be decided. When the light from the machine faded, Cal did not hesitate. The moment his feet touched the stone floor of the hidden chamber, he ran.
He had already seen the truth. He had already watched the moment where everything went wrong. Now he had only one purpose: stop it before it happened. Cal raced through the underground tunnel and climbed the narrow staircase that led into the castle halls. His footsteps echoed softly against the stone walls, but he did not slow down. Above him, Moonspire Citadel was quiet. The night had already deepened. Most of the castle had gone to sleep. Cal knew exactly how much time he had. He had watched the moment before. He knew when Prince Alaric would begin walking toward the king's chamber, and this time, Cal would be waiting. The corridors of the royal wing were dimly lit by a few dying torches. Shadows stretched along the stone walls. Cal reached the hallway and stopped near one of the large pillars. This was the exact place where he had hidden during his last return. But tonight was different. Tonight, he would not stand the shadows. Tonight, he would stop the prince before he ever reached the door. Minutes passed slowly. The castle was silent. Cal could hear his own breathing. His heart pounded heavily inside his chest. Even after everything he had seen, a part of him still struggled to believe the truth. Alaric had been like a brother to him. They had trained together, fought together, grown up under the same roof. But now Cal knew what the prince had become and what he intended to do. Then Cal heard the footsteps, the same careful footsteps he had heard before, coming from the far end of the corridor. Prince Alaric appeared from the shadows, walking calmly through the dim torchlight. A cloak covered his shoulders. His face looks calm, confident, just as it had during every previous attempt. But this time, Cal stepped forward before the prince could reach the chamber. Alaric. The prince stopped immediately. For a brief moment, confusion crossed his face. Then his eyes narrowed. Cal? He looked genuinely surprised. You should be in the northern barracks tonight. Cal said nothing. The silence between them grew heavy. Alaric studied him carefully. Then slowly a faint smile appeared on the prince's face. You know. It was not a question. It was a statement. Cal's voice was quiet. Yes. The smile on Alaric's face faded. Well, the prince sighed softly, that complicates things. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Alaric reached beneath his cloak and pulled out the same blade Cal had seen before, the blade that had taken the king's life so many times before. But not tonight. You don't understand, Alaric said calmly. My father built his kingdom on fear. He ruled like a tyrant, and everyone simply accepted it. Cal's jaw tightened. That doesn't give you the right to murder him. Alaric's eyes hardened. It gives me the right to become something greater. The air between them suddenly changed. The ancient blood of wolves ran through both of them, and their instincts responded to the coming battle. Bones cracked, muscles expanded, fur spread across their skin. Within seconds, two powerful alpha wolves stood facing each other in the corridor. The torches flickered violently as their power filled the hallway. Alaric attacked first. The prince lunged forward with terrifying speed, his claws striking toward Cale's throat. Cale twisted aside just in time, the claws scraping across the stone wall behind him. The sound echoed loudly through the corridor. The fight exploded into motion. Two alpha wolves crashing against each other with brutal strength. Claws tore through stone pillars. Teeth snapped inches from flesh. The narrow hallway shook under the force of their battle. Alaric was strong, stronger than Cale had ever seen him before. Years of hiding his true nature had made the prince dangerous. But Cale had something Alaric did not expect. He had already fought this battle in his mind 100 times. He had already watched the prince's movements. He knew his speed, his strength, his patterns. The wolves crashed into the wall, sending fragments of stone across the floor. Alaric snarled and lunged again, but this time Cale was ready. He twisted beneath the attack and slammed his full weight against the prince. The two wolves rolled across the floor in a violent struggle. Then Cale forced Alaric down. For a moment, they stared at each other. breathing hard, blood running from small wounds across their fur. Ulrich's voice came through the wolf's snarl. "You think killing me will change anything?" Kale's golden eyes burned. "It will save him." The fight ended in one final clash. A flash of claws, a powerful strike, then silence. When the echoes faded, the corridor grew quiet again. Kale slowly returned to his human form. His breathing was heavy. Before him, the body of Prince Ulrich lay motionless. The prince who would have destroyed the kingdom, the prince who would have killed his own father. Moments later, the door of the king's chamber opened. The Alpha King stepped into the corridor. His eyes widened as he saw Kale standing there and the body on the floor. "What happened here?" the king asked. Kale looked at him. For a moment, he did not know what to say. How could he explain the impossible? How could he explain the countless nights he had lived through? The journeys through time, the truth he had uncovered. Finally, Kale simply said quietly, "I stopped a betrayal." The king looked at him for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. And for the first time that night, the future of Aldrin changed. Years later, the kingdom would still speak about the night the Alpha King was saved, the night the crown prince fell, the night the adopted son protected the throne. But only one man would ever know the full truth. Only one man would remember the countless versions of that terrible night. The man who had traveled through time itself to save the kingdom. Kale, the wolf who refused to let fate win.